difficulty, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Jonathan Roger, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the August 16th issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The first article is entitled, "A Castro Linked to Smuggling Becomes an Envoy to the U.S." by David Adams and Francis Robles. Raul Castro was on an official state visit in Paris a decade ago as Cuba's president when a hulky bodyguard in his entourage stood out. The man kept so close to Mr. Castro when they walked the red carpet at the Élysée Palace that a member of the French honor guard tried pulling him back. Even François Hollande, France's president at the time, waved him back. The security escort who kept inserting himself in official photos was none other than Mr. Castro's grandson, Raul G. Rodriguez Castro, a colonel in the Interior Ministry. Today, the once largely unknown bodyguard has become a key figure in Cuba's talks with the United States, even though he has never held public office. His name has even come up as someone the Trump administration might find acceptable to become Cuba's next leader. He exemplifies how that government operates, said Tim Reiser, a foreign policy aide to former Senator Patrick Leahy, a Democrat from Vermont, who met Mr. Rodriguez Castro several times. It's a lot like a family business, and so someone who has described to us a decade ago as President Castro's bodyguard has, for whatever reason, by whatever means, become something much more than that. But Mr. Rodriguez Castro, who has met with some of the most senior people in the Trump administration, may have also used his considerable influence to protect a large-scale smuggling operation that moved people out of Cuba and brought illicit goods into the country, according to interviews and court records. Mr. Rodriguez Castro, 42, was accused of helping funnel goods purchased with stolen credit cards into the country, receiving luxury items as bribes, and allowing wanted criminals to roam free on the island, the interviews and court records show. And accompanying this article is a photo of Mr. Rodriguez Castro and his grandfather, Raul Castro, and the caption is Raul Rodriguez Castro left with Miguel Diaz-Canel of Cuba and the May Day parade in Havana last year. The scheme was the target of a federal investigation that resulted in the convictions of at least 21 people and decades-long sentences. Mr. Rodriguez Castro has not been charged. This article is based on court documents and interviews with nearly a dozen people who either know Mr. Rodriguez Castro personally, including one person close to the U.S. negotiations, or are familiar with the criminal investigation in which his name surfaced. Mr. Rodriguez Castro did not respond to requests for an interview sent through formal diplomatic channels and a mutual acquaintance. A top Cuban official called the accusations slanderous. Mr. Rodriguez Castro's prominent role in the discussions with the Trump administration seemed to astound some Cuban officials who viewed him as merely a caretaker for his grandfather. Still, an official with the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cuba took to social media last month to say Mr. Rodriguez Castro had been the subject of character assassination in the U.S. media, which was aimed at making the Cuban government appear divided. As he helps Cuba's government try to survive and navigate its standoff with the United States, those who have spoken to Mr. Rodriguez Castro say he has made no secret of his ultimate ambition to be his country's next president, though it is unclear whether he has the internal support to do so. The Cuban smugglers. The human smuggling network was known as the Cuban Mafia in Quintana Roo. Its name came from the state in eastern Mexico where it was based. The ring used boats stolen from Florida to sneak people out of Cuba who wanted to reach the United States, according to the Justice Department and members of the criminal gang who cooperated with prosecutors. The Cuban migrants would be taken to Mexico, where they were held in safe houses until they paid smuggling fees and were tortured if they didn't, according to court testimony. Two defendants in the case implicated Mr. Rodriguez Castro as a collaborator in the organization, according to court records and interviews with several people familiar with the investigation. Both defendants, Jose Miguel Gonzalez Vidal and Reynaldo Crespo Marquez, pleaded guilty and were sentenced to long prison terms for their roles in the scheme. Mr. Rodriguez Castro arranged safe passage for the group into and out of Cuba, a leader of the group told U.S. prosecutors, according to several people familiar with the case. Mr. Rodriguez Castro's name came up in a U.S. Department of Justice case in 2020 against the group, according to evidence gathered by prosecutors and one of the people familiar with the investigation. The people who know Mr. Rodriguez Castro spoke on the condition of anonymity to preserve relationships with Cuban government officials, and those familiar with the criminal case did so to discuss sensitive legal matters they were not authorized to disclose. It is unclear whether Mr. Rodriguez Castro is the target of the continuing investigation. The Justice Department declined to comment. The smuggling ring stole vessels from South Florida to bribe foreign officials, according to an admission statement filed in federal court as part of a guilty plea signed by Mr. Gonzalez Vidal, who was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The statement does not name Mr. Rodriguez Castro, but Mr. Gonzalez Vidal and another defendant told U.S. authorities that Mr. Rodriguez Castro was among the foreign officials who received a stolen boat, court records show. The issue was also discussed in open court. During a September 2023 trial in Miami, a defense lawyer asked Mr. Crespo, who was a cooperating witness about a meeting in which he told prosecutors that Mr. Gonzalez Vidal and Mr. Rodriguez Castro had discussed sending him a boat in Cuba. Mr. Crespo is serving 20 years in prison for his role in the smuggling operation. Mr. Gonzalez Vidal said the men who smuggled migrants and goods bribed Mr. Rodriguez Castro to keep the Cuban Coast Guard and Customs away, three of the people said, in exchange for allowing merchandise that the smuggling network bought in Mexico with stolen credit cards to clear Cuban customs. Mr. Rodriguez Castro was given a Fountain 38 high-performance boat and various other gifts, including a Rolex watch, a Suzuki motorbike, and Louis Vuitton clothes, Mr. Rodriguez Vidal claimed. The products were later sold in Cuban government stores, he said. Mr. Gonzalez Vidal's account was supported by text and voicemail messages that the FBI extracted from the cell phones of members of the smuggling ring, the people familiar with the case said. Mr. Gonzalez Vidal's lawyer, Juan Barrios, declined to comment. Mr. Rodriguez Castro, in a recent interview with USA Today, which some critics took to be self-promotional, said he had no wealth of his own. Wealthy friends and admirers had paid for fashionable clothes, luxury foreign vehicles, and expensive overseas trips, he said. There's no link. Cuba's deputy foreign minister, Carlos R. Fernandez de Cosio, in an interview with The Times in Havana, called the accusations against Mr. Rodriguez Castro involving the smuggling ring slander. He said that for several years during migration talks with the United States, Cuban officials had repeatedly raised concerns about widespread smuggling of Cubans through Central America and Mexico. They received no response, he said. We alerted them, meeting after meeting. Have you taken action? What have you done? Mr. Fernandez de Cosio said. I cannot doubt whatsoever there are organizations in Mexico and Central America and in other parts of Latin America which involve Cubans that have been making money and had a business of smuggling aliens into the United States. But I can assure you, he added, there's no link with the Cuban government. The State Department did not respond to a request for comment. One American close to the U.S.-Cuba discussions said that, despite the allegations of smuggling, Mr. Rodriguez Castro was considered a worthy representative to interact with the Trump administration because his fondness for material goods suggested he was open to capitalist ideas. Mr. Rodriguez Castro is not apologetic about his lifestyle. It pains me that many people can't live the way I do, Mr. Rodriguez Castro told USA Today, and I'm working every day to change the situation. A golden boy. Mr. Rodriguez Castro is the son of Raul Castro's eldest daughter, Deborah Castro Espin, and the late General Luis Alberto Rodriguez Lopez Calleja, a powerful figure who helped establish Cuba's military conglomerate known as Gaesa, which manages much of Cuba's ailing economy. His parents had a troubled marriage, so Mr. Rodriguez Castro, who is also known as Raulito, spent much of his youth at his grandparents' house, several people who knew him in his youth said. His nickname, which is how he is commonly known, is El Cangrejo, meaning the crab, and was given to him because he was born with an extra finger on one hand. Despite his revolutionary roots, he is descended from an upper-class family. His grandmother was an heir to the Bacardi rum fortune. He enjoyed extreme sports and music with racy lyrics and was less polished than other members of Cuba's revolutionary elite. He studied economics at the University of Havana, where he received credit for traveling with his grandfather, said Juan Almeida, the exiled son of a hero of the 1959 Cuba Revolution, who was close to the Castro family for many years. He described Mr. Rodriguez Castro as affectionate and friendly. He is better known outside Cuba than inside, he said. Cangrejo and all the Castros know that their power only lasts until the day his grandfather dies. Mr. Rodriguez Castro, who is often photographed wearing expensive designer clothes, was widely known during his younger years for being spotted in videos partying at concerts, hanging out with the reggaeton duo Gente de Zona, and on boats. One family member said he sometimes traveled around Havana in one of his grandfather's BMWs, which irked some who thought it projected a bad image in a country where people suffer severe food, medicine, and power shortages. Mr. Rodriguez Castro has enjoyed extraordinary access, attending virtually every one of his grandfather's meetings, including with the late Pope Francis. After serving as a bodyguard, he became more of a personal assistant for Mr. Castro, 95, who was vice president for decades and became president in 2006 when his brother Fidel fell ill. While he no longer holds any official government post, Mr. Castro is widely considered the most powerful person in Cuba. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. After Cuba began secret meetings with the United States this year seeking to end sanctions imposed by the Trump administration, Mr. Rodriguez Castro met separately with CIA Director John Ratcliffe and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The CIA has covertly created a task force as part of the U.S. campaign to pressure Cuba into political, economic, and leadership change, the Times has reported. Arturo Lopez Levy, a research associate at the University of Denver, who is a second cousin to Mr. Rodriguez Castro, said much of the criticism of his relative is based on videos of rowdy behavior that circulated more than a decade ago. He has not spoken to his cousin in about 7 or 8 years, he said, but his public persona appears to have changed considerably. The relationship with his grandfather has changed from a young man who was quite immature to someone with political knowledge and connection to his grandfather, not only for the protection of his life, but politically, said Mr. Lopez Levy, a former analyst at Cuba's Ministry of Interior. He has not been outside the door. He has been inside every meeting. The next article is entitled After Professor's Death, Questions for Cambridge. This article is by Mira Vendsal, Megan Specia, Leo Sands, Ali Watkins, and Susan Dominus. Cambridge, England. When Cambridge University interviewed Jason Arday for one of the most prestigious sociology positions in the world, he was an early career scholar and underqualified by the school's own standards. Cambridge's requirements, reviewed by the New York Times, called for, quote, an outstanding research record of international stature, end quote, and a, quote, proven professional track record, end quote, supervising PhD students. Dr. Arday had a modest publication record and had bounced from one university to the next, not staying long enough to oversee a full 3-year or more doctorate. Cambridge hired him anyway in 2023, making him, at 37, the university's youngest black professor at a time when the school was under pressure to diversify. In doing so, Cambridge thrust him into the international limelight, giving him a platform at one of the world's elite universities to champion academic diversity and making him a target for critics. Dr. Arday was found dead in London on Friday, days after resigning his job amid accusations that he had plagiarized chunks of his papers, embellished parts of his recently published memoir, and fabricated aspects of his life story. The controversy exploded along cultural fault lines: race, neurodiversity, and academic hiring. In his August 5th resignation letter, he wrote, quote, I no longer wish to feel as though I am living under a constant spotlight where every aspect of my life is subject to public examination and judgment, end quote. He added, quote, this is not the end of my work. It is simply the end of this chapter, end quote. His family said that since starting at Cambridge, Dr. Arday had faced a campaign of scrutiny intended to undermine him. That became too much for him, they said. Questions about Dr. Arday's career are unlikely to end with his death, however, because they were as much about Cambridge as they were about him. The centuries-old alma mater of Isaac Newton, William Wordsworth, and kings and queens, Cambridge now faces deep scrutiny about its decision-making, even from its own faculty. While Dr. Arday was underqualified for his job, he had a remarkable story, a tale of being diagnosed early with autism and having such significant developmental delays that he spent his entire childhood in a special needs school. In his account, he did not speak until age 11 or read until age 18, yet he managed to earn his doctorate and began giving keynote speeches on the academic circuit. Also, he had run 30 marathons in 35 days for charity, a feat that would have placed him among the world's elite athletes. If, in hindsight, elements of Dr. Arday's story seemed too good to be true, Cambridge ignored repeated warning signs. A review of internal Cambridge documents and interviews with former colleagues and associates shows that in addition to passing over more experienced candidates for the job, administrators gushed publicly about Dr. Arday's scholarship and privately disregarded complaints about his work. They declined to investigate plagiarism concerns and accused his critics of a, quote, vile campaign, end quote, to discredit him. Dr. Arday's claims about not speaking, were false, a former classmate and speech professional who worked with him told the New York Times. His supposedly remarkable trajectory from nonverbal preteen to PhD had no precedent in medical literature, experts in developmental and speech delays say. That should have set off alarm bells for the Cambridge hiring committee, which included a child psychiatrist who had done research on autism, experts said. Before Dr. Arday's death, conservative commentators seized on his fall as evidence of diversity and inclusion efforts run amok. They said that Cambridge had been so eager to diversify that administrators let their judgment be clouded. Quote, they seem to have drunk the DEI Kool-Aid, end quote, Jacob Rees-Mogg, a former conservative lawmaker in Britain, said last week on the Telegraph's Daily Tea podcast. Prominent academics on the left agree that Cambridge must answer for its decisions. They say that the ordeal has fueled racism and cast unjustified aspersions on accomplished scholars of color. Cambridge said on Friday that it was desperately saddened to hear of Dr. Arday's death. An administrator, in a letter to the faculty on Tuesday, called the misconduct accusations an aberration and troubling. A spokesman separately declined to answer a list of questions about his hiring and his time there, citing a planned independent investigation, a difficult inquiry that will likely be made even more uncomfortable following Dr. Arday's death. Dr. Arday, for his part, had worked hard to silence any questioning of his credentials. When a journalist for Times Higher Education, a respected academic industry publication, asked about plagiarism last year, a prominent British defamation law firm helped kill the article, the journalist said. Dr. Arday later reported the journalist to the police. When a scholar from another university questioned his work, Dr. Arday turned the tables and filed a racism complaint with the other school, according to someone with direct knowledge of the complaint. That person like some others who spoke to the Times, spoke on the condition of anonymity to avoid being dragged publicly into the controversy. Dr. Arday never squarely addressed the questions of plagiarism and fabrication. But what is clear from interviews and public records is that elements of the story would have been easy for Cambridge to check. Stretches of credulity. Dr. Arday, the child of Ghanaian immigrants, grew up in public housing in an ethnically mixed working-class quarter of South London. Early on, he was identified as having learning difficulties. Dr. Arday has claimed that before age 11, he could understand language but not speak. In 2022, before interviewing with Cambridge, he said that he had been educated exclusively in a special needs school, quote, with other pupils that had very severe learning difficulties and physical disabilities, end quote. In his memoir published on Tuesday, he gave a different account, saying he attended a mainstream school but spent time sequestered alone in a classroom, again without speaking. Both tales are false according to people who knew Dr. Arday as a child and spoke with the Times before his death. A speech professional who worked closely with the young Dr. Arday recalled him having a language delay but speaking with both children and adults. One former schoolmate, Jonathan Stewart, recalled Dr. Arday cracking jokes and putting on playful accents in a minivan on the way to church activities as children. While nonverbal children can certainly learn to speak even at a late age, the rapid development described by Dr. Arday has no precedent in clinical literature, 3 experts on autism speech said. Quote, in over 40 years of practice and being very acquainted with the literature, I've never heard of that happening, end quote, said Stephen Camarada, a speech science expert with Vanderbilt Health's Developmental Disabilities Lab. Quote, it just stretches credulity, end quote. A young professor. An established chair at Cambridge, a permanently funded position that comes with prestige and research support, is among the academic world's most sought-after jobs. Dr. Arday applied for an established chair of education. The university advertised internationally for the job and convened a panel of 9 experts to review the candidates. The panel selected 4 finalists, inviting them to Cambridge for 2 days of interviews. Dr. Arday was up against 3 more senior scholars, including 2 women of color, according to a person familiar with the hiring process. Dr. Arday's published papers and his thesis had dozens of grammatical errors, along with identical quotes attributed to different people. At Cambridge, the finalists were asked to submit just one piece of research, according to the person familiar with the process. It is not clear which piece he submitted or whether members of the hiring panel reviewed Dr. Arday's speeches and interviews. If they had, they would have found that elements of his story that stretched belief, like the marathon claim, or were demonstrably false, like his public assertion that he had been on the British television series 7 Up. Dr. Arday's spokesman recently said that the assertion should not have been taken literally. Experts said that Cambridge's hiring panel was well equipped to question Dr. Arday's very public claims about his childhood. Some committee members had published papers about teaching students with learning disabilities and about inclusion in education. One influential member of the hiring panel, the child psychiatrist Paul Ramchandani, had published a paper on music therapy for children with autism. Given his expertise, he would have been in a position to question Dr. Arday's assertion that he learned to speak at 11 and read at 18, said Howard Shane, the director emeritus of the Center for Communication Enhancement at Boston Children's Hospital. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. That should have raised a red flag, he said in an interview last week. There's no question about that. Dr. Ramchandani and others on the panel did not respond to requests for comment. The committee hired Dr. Arday in a decision that the Education Department chair described at the time as unanimous. Cambridge's lengthy hiring announcement highlighted his remarkable personal story, which garnered media coverage on both sides of the Atlantic. Cambridge had so few black professors that it was under pressure from faculty and students to diversify. It had set modest targets for increasing applications from people of color for academic posts. On the BBC, the Education Department chair, Hilary Kremen, told Dr. Arday that he was, quote, the best in the world in terms of the research you do, end quote. She did not respond to requests for comment. Questions surface. 3 months after Dr. Arday's hiring, 2 British scholars, Martin Hammersley and David Harris, privately wrote to Cambridge alerting administrators to potential plagiarism in one of Dr. Arday's papers. Dr. Kremen, the department chair, replied that she had met with Dr. Arday and that he had agreed to address concerns in the paper. She also mentioned his, quote, ongoing experiences of direct and indirect racism, end quote, along with, quote, significant health issues, end quote, that had affected his work on the paper in question, according to an email, which was first reported on a former professor's newsletter and the academic integrity website Retraction Watch. Dr. Harris, whose work has challenged whether racism is ingrained in society, responded by suggesting that Cambridge also review Dr. Arday's other papers and his thesis. Quote, Professor Arday badly needs critical friends, in my view, not sycophants, end quote, he wrote. He never got a reply, he said, nor did Cambridge act months later after journals appended corrections on 2 of Dr. Arday's papers. Then, in September 2025, Times Higher Education sent Cambridge a dossier of more than 60 pages that detailed apparent plagiarism in Dr. Arday's work. A reporter and editor at the publication, Jack Grove, had enlisted experts to review Dr. Arday's thesis. One of them, David Sanders of Purdue University, told the Times that going into the review, he knew nothing about Jason Arday. But when Dr. Sanders sat down to analyze the thesis, he concluded it was, quote, extensively plagiarized, end quote. Cambridge continued to back its star professor, telling Mr. Grove that questions about Dr. Arday's thesis would have to be addressed to the school that had awarded his doctorate, Liverpool John Moores University. Concerns about his research, Cambridge said, would similarly have to be handled by others. Liverpool John Moores stood by his doctorate. At Cambridge, faculty members and allies hurriedly drafted a letter in anticipation of Mr. Grove's article. Quote, "The integrity of higher education is at risk if we do not take a stand and speak out against systematic attempts to erase black scholarship," end quote, they wrote in a letter, a copy of which was seen by the Times. But Mr. Grove's article never ran. Dr. Arday's lawyers threatened legal action, and Times Higher Education spiked it. Dr. Arday also filed a police complaint against Mr. Grove, which led to a harassment investigation that was later dropped. A scandal erupts. The plagiarism charges burst into public view last month when a former Cambridge scholar, Nathan Kofnas, wrote about them in his newsletter. Dr. Kofnas is known for his work suggesting that black people were genetically predisposed to be less intelligent than white people. The university had cut ties with him in 2024. Retraction Watch quickly expanded on Dr. Kofnas's reporting, but once again, Cambridge defended Dr. Arday, saying he was, quote, "the victim of a vile campaign to undermine his credibility, which must stop," end quote, according to an email seen by the Times. After new questions surfaced, casting doubt on Dr. Arday's story, he resigned. Cambridge's tone shifted. But the fallout from Cambridge's enthusiastic promotion of Dr. Arday's story could last for years. Quote, "This has really done some harm," end quote, Dr. Karmada, the speech specialist, said before Dr. Arday's death. He said that over the years, he heard from families of children with severe autism hoping for a miracle. "I never want to take away anybody's hope," he said, "but this story really has created some unreasonable expectations and false hopes, and I hate that." Heidi Mirza, an emeritus professor of education at University College London, who once mentored Dr. Arday, said in an interview this month that he had been ill-served by university administrators' carelessness in their efforts to demonstrate their commitment to diversity. Quote, "He's a pawn," end quote, she said, quote, "whose ambition made him vulnerable," end quote. The next article is entitled, "In Wyoming, Intense Battle for Control Rends the GOP," by David W. Chen, Devil's Tower, Wyoming. In the shadow of Devil's Tower, the national monument immortalized by Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, an election year fight has erupted between Wyoming's right and its far right, with serious implications for the state's political future. On the far right is State Representative Chip Newman, the House Speaker and a member of Wyoming's ultra-conservative Freedom Caucus, the country's first such caucus to control a state house chamber. On the merely right is State Senator Ogden Driscoll, whose chamber has often thwarted the Freedom Caucus agenda. In an unusual gamble, Mr. Neiman is giving up his speaker's gavel to take on Mr. Driscoll, a former state Senate president, in the Republican primary on Tuesday. "Challenging the status quo, I think, is critical," Mr. Neiman said at his cattle ranch in Hewlett, Wyoming. "We need to move more conservatives to the Senate." With U.S. Senator Cynthia Lummis declining to seek re-election, Harriet Hageman vacating the state's lone House seat to run for Senate, and Governor Mark Gordon facing term limits, Wyoming voters are presented with a choice from the State House to the Governor's Mansion to the U.S. Capitol. They can expand or check ultra-conservative power. The schism echoes struggles between institutionalists and insurgents elsewhere, especially among Democrats, but it feels especially personal in Wyoming. The nation's least populous state has produced national figures: Dick and Liz Cheney, former Senator Alan Simpson, and the current Senate Majority Whip John Barroso. It has also attracted an influx of billionaires, heightening class anger and affordability issues. If hard-right candidates triumph, some groups, such as common sense Republicans, warn of deep cuts to schools, towns, and law enforcement. Americans for Prosperity, a veteran conservative group that targeted moderate Montana Republican legislators this year, is championing more than a dozen non-Freedom Caucus legislative candidates, Mr. Driscoll included. Freedom Caucus legislators weren't willing to work with others to find a solution, said Tyler Lindholm, the Wyoming State Director of Americans for Prosperity and a former state representative who lost to Mr. Neiman in the 2020 primary. The first plank of the Wyoming Republican Party's 23-plank platform, trumpeted by the Freedom Caucus, declares that life begins at conception. Others highlight the role of faith and biblical principles in the nation's founding and the freedom to decline childhood vaccines. Campaign signs on ranches and roads tout platform Republican candidates, but Mr. Driscoll dismissed what he called a platform purity test. This year, Mr. Driscoll, 67, helped block attempts to slash funding to the University of Wyoming and gut the state's Economic Development Office. Elected in 2010, he planned to retire at the year's end to the family's Camp Stool Ranch at the foot of Devil's Tower, where his father shook hands with Mr. Spielberg 50 years ago. But when Mr. Neiman, who lives 5 miles down the highway, sought to succeed him, Mr. Driscoll decided to fight. "I hate the Freedom Caucus and how they do business," he said. Mr. Neiman, 59, said Mr. Driscoll has Freedom Caucus derangement syndrome. Elected in 2020, Mr. Neiman pushed to make Wyoming the first state to ban abortion pills, a law struck down by the state Supreme Court. He supported a program that offers $7,000 per student vouchers to pay for private school tuition. He criticized the state Senate for failing to ban what he called sexually explicit books from libraries and schools. "I don't know what the Lord's plan is, but I'm glad to just let him order my steps," he said, pounding in campaign signs with his son on Highway 14. Priorities include shrinking government, tightening voting rules, and curtailing activist judges, said State Representative Rachel Williams, the Freedom Caucus chairwoman who is running for Secretary of State. "The left tends to be very loud in Wyoming," she said, "and our supporters tend to be the silent majority." Early voting started on July 21st in Sundance, Wyoming, where signs warn, "Do not Jackson Hole my Sundance," Amy Goodson, executive director of the Crook County Museum District, said Mr. Driscoll helped save a historic school by turning it into a cultural center. Quote, "Every roadblock they put in front of him," he said, "that's not a no, that's a what else can you do," she said. End quote. At Wyoming's oldest general store in Aladdin near the South Dakota border, Jordan Yates, co-owner, likes the Driscolls' protected 5,000 acres surrounding Devil's Tower from future development. But Trent Tope, her fiancé and co-owner, said Mr. Neiman is more approachable. He has been to the store, goes to churches, and shows up to pie socials. Quote, even though I don't agree with everything, at least I can speak to the man and not feel like a peasant, end quote, he said. This article is accompanied by a number of photos. The caption for the top three reads, State Representative Chip Neiman left the House Speaker and Freedom Caucus member is looking to unseat Ogden Driscoll Wright in the state Senate seat, which is often at odds with the caucus. And the top left photograph shows a man wearing jeans, a blue denim shirt and jeans with a dog, and the man's wearing a baseball cap and cowboy boots. And the right photo shows an older gentleman wearing a cowboy hat and plaid button-down short-sleeve shirt and jeans, seated in front of a panoramic view. The middle photo shows a river passing through scenic landscape. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The next article is from the Times obituary section, and it's entitled John Crowley, 83, wrote Reality Blurring Fantasy. It's accompanied by a photo of Mr. Crowley in 2009, and the caption reads, John Crowley in 2009, the author of 14 novels. His work drew comparisons to C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Thomas Pynchon. There's also a graphic of two of his novels, which include The Deep and Little Big. And the caption reads, Mr. Crowley's first novel, The Deep, published in 1975, included a war between two factions. Little Big, published in 1981, was Mr. Crowley's best known and most widely read novel. The article is by Clay Risen. John Crowley, an author of sweeping fantastical narratives, whose ability to blend such disparate material as American history, Dreams of Lost Utopias, and Alice in Wonderland-tinged occult allowed him to transcend the fantasy genre in novels like Little Big, which the critic Harold Bloom called a neglected masterpiece, died on August 9th at his home in Conway, Massachusetts. He was 83. His wife, Lori Block, said the cause was complications of dysphagia and dementia. The author of 14 novels and 10 volumes of essays and short fiction, Mr. Crowley explored a considerable range of subjects and genres. His first novel, The Deep, 1975, was set on a disc-shaped world and involved a war between two factions, the Reds and the Blacks, loosely based on the 15th century War of the Roses in England. Even his most straightforward realistic novel, Four Freedoms, 2009, about the workers at an airplane factory in Oklahoma during World War II, is an alternative history of the home front in which Americans of marginalized identities, Black Americans, women, disabled people, find themselves liberated by a common purpose. His work drew comparisons to C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Thomas Pynchon. Reviewers recognized notes of Dante, Shakespeare, and Lewis Carroll. Writing in the Washington Post in 2000, the critic Michael Dirda called Mr. Crowley, quote, arguably the most original and accomplished American fantasy writer ever, end quote. Despite his wide range, certain themes persisted. He was consistently interested in the way that narrative shapes perception, in the sometimes murky line between fantasy and reality, in the possibility, as he wrote in his 1987 novel Egypt, parenthetically eventually republished as The Solitudes, that there is more than one history of the world. Quote, Little, Big, Mr. end quote, Mr. Crowley's fourth novel was his best known and most widely read. Its plot revolves around the long marriage of Smoky Barnable and Daly Alice Drinkwater, which plays out against a tableau of urban decay, a fascist takeover of the United States, and a rural manse that offers a gateway to a realm of fairies and possibly a redemptive future. Any summary of its plot makes it sound twee. In fact, it is an achingly melancholic and deeply humane meditation on mortality and memory. Like all Mr. Crowley's book, Little Big reads almost like a fable, starting with its first sentence, quote, On a certain day in June 19 a young man was making his way on foot northward from the great city to a town or place called Edgewood that he had been told of but had never visited, end quote. Mr. Crowley continued, quote, His name was Smoky Barnable, and he was going to Edgewood to get married. The fact that he walked and didn't ride was one of the conditions placed on his coming there at all, end quote. The poet James Merrill was a gushing fan of Little Big and arranged for Mr. Crowley to receive a grant from the Ingram Merrill Foundation, which Mr. Merrill directed. The eminent fantasy writer Ursula K. Le Guin said it calls for a redefinition of fantasy. Mr. Bloom, the critic, wrote that it was, quote, literally the most enchanting 20th century work I know, end quote. It was named the best novel at the 1982 World Fantasy Awards, the highest prize in the genre. Mr. Crowley was unafraid of boldly original stories and sprawling epics. The 4 books in his Egypt cycle, written over 2 decades, follow the waking and dream life of a historian named Pierce Moffat, with parallel storylines set during the Renaissance. His 2017 novel, Ka, Dar Oakley in the Ruin of Ymir, centers on a sentient, immortal crow as it follows the course of human history. Quote, the kind of fiction that always interested me, end quote, Mr. Crowley told The Believer magazine in 2009, quote, is the stuff that somehow manages to be convincingly actual, in the sense that you believe that the truths are being told you, that truths are being told about the world you live in, and are also somehow connected to the imaginary in some way, end quote. John Michael Crowley was born on December 1st, 1942, in Presque Isle, Maine, where his father Joseph was a doctor with the Army. His mother, Patience Lyon Crowley, managed the home and later worked as a librarian. The family moved frequently because of Dr. Crowley's work, living in Vermont, eastern Kentucky, and finally Indiana. Though he at times dreamed of becoming an archaeologist or a set designer, Mr. Crowley studied English at Indiana University. As a freshman, he was a member of the university's quiz team, which won the 1961 GE College Bowl, an event broadcast on national television. After graduating in 1965, he moved to New York, where he wrote documentary screenplays. He moved to Western Massachusetts in the mid-1970s, where he began writing fiction. He continued to write documentaries, eventually joining his wife, Ms. Block, in forming Straight Ahead Pictures, a nonprofit production company. His film scripts include The World of Tomorrow, 1984, about the 1939 World's Fair, and with Ms. Block, Fit, Episodes in the History of the Body, 1991, about American fitness culture. Mr. Crowley and Ms. Block married in 1984. He is survived by their children, Hazel and Xander Crowley, and his sister, Jo Busha. Thanks to the presence on the Yale English faculty of two of his great admirers, the poet John Hollander and Mr. Bloom, Mr. Crowley became a lecturer there in 1993, retiring in 2018. Mr. Crowley insisted to his students and readers that fantasy was, at its heart, no different from any other genre and could achieve greatness if it followed the rules of literature. Quote, to actually articulate a way of being in a literary world without boundaries between reality and fantasy. It can't just be a bunch of craziness and surreal carrying on, end quote, he told Locus magazine in 2010. He added, quote, fantasy fiction at bottom or at its best is about making true fictions by the rules in worlds you make up out of whole cloth or out of your heart, end quote. And now from the Metropolitan Diary of the New York section is a letter entitled Love the Fit. Dear Diary, when New York doesn't drive me nuts, it makes me smile, mostly because I talk to strangers on a daily basis. A few years ago, my husband and I were returning home on a sweet Saturday evening after seeing the Edward Russia exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. Heading south on the F, I stood up well before the train pulled into West 4th Street because I love the feeling of surfing the ride. One person in a fun group of 20-somethings who were in the car noticed my black jumpsuit and vintage fringed jacket. Love the fit, they said, and love the earrings. I noticed their lacy white top. And I love your look, I replied, adding that I had just turned 63. Girl, you're rocking it. As we pulled into the station, we each took one last look. I love everything about you, I said. I love everything about you, they echoed. I practically skipped home to Thompson Street. From Beth Sadel. The next article is entitled How It's Done. Dear Diary, some years ago I was knitting while riding the Fifth Avenue bus from the mid-'80s to the mid-'50s when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see a woman. She asked how far I was riding and then said I should move over. She wanted to show me how to knit properly. By Carol Waxman. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the August 16th issue of the front section of the New York Times. We read from the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1 p.m. Your reader has been Jonathan Roger. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times opinion page. Following that, at 3 o'clock, the New York Times Arts and Leisure, and at 4 o'clock, a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Radio Reading mails out a large print program schedule to our listeners every other month. If you have not received a Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service large print program schedule in the mail, please call us at 716-821-5555. We will make sure that you receive one every other month. A Braille version of the schedule is also available upon request. Our number again is 716-821-5555. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability